Could you hold your kit tighter or something? The snarl came from behind Grace Parker, slicing through the packed midnight bus. Her arms tightened instinctively around Lily, her 2-year-old daughter, still fast asleep on her chest. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice raw from fatigue. But before she could shift, Lily let out a sharp cry that bounced off every cold window. Murmurs, eye rolls, and judgment spread like wildfire. The driver barked. "Ma'am, get her quiet." Grace's hands trembled. Then a calm voice. "May I try something?" A stranger across the aisle reached out with quiet kindness. Moments later, Lily slept soundly in his arms and Grace, too exhausted to resist, leaned into his shoulder. He said nothing, only wrapped his coat gently around her child. She didn't know who he was. But weeks later, that same man would turn down $1 million offer, just to build a home named after her daughter. Because sometimes the ones who carry the most are the ones no one ever sees. Stay with this story. If you believe in dignity, drop it in the comments. And if you still believe in the kind of love that rebuilds lives, this channel is your home. Grace Parker was 28 years old, though the lines beneath her eyes told stories that stretched far beyond. Her dark auburn hair was always pulled into a messy bun, not by style but by necessity. A faded olive green coat clung to her slender frame, its zipper half broken, just like the radiator in her apartment. Most days she wore the same pair of jeans, frayed at the hem, softened by hundreds of washes and just as many worries. There was a quiet pride in how she walked. Upright, steady, even when her legs ached after a 10-hour shift slinging coffee and wiping counters at the late-night diner downtown. Grace didn't complain. She simply folded the pain beneath layers of silence. She was the kind of woman who smiled at strangers but trusted no one, who folded Lily's baby clothes into perfect squares while sitting alone on the kitchen floor at midnight. Her routine was rigid. Wake at 5, pack Lily's daycare bag, catch the 6:15 bus, pour coffee until her fingers numbed, return home, reheat soup, kiss her child's forehead and start all over again. She lived in a third-floor walk-up with peeling linoleum, flickering lights, and a leaky kitchen faucet that sang all night like sorrow in a rhythm. Grace had no family left. Her mother had died of cancer the year Lily was born, and Lily's father had vanished 3 months into the pregnancy with nothing but a cruel voicemail and a shattered promise. She was invisible to the world, until her child cried too loud, or took up an inch too much space. Then everyone noticed. Then came the sighs, the glares, the words that stung deeper than any bruise. And on that particular night, as snow laced the city in silence, the bus was full, the judgment was sharp, and the first sign of something shifting came not with a word, but with a cry, a stranger, and a single empty seat. "Could you maybe hold your kit tighter or something?" The voice came from behind, sharp as broken glass. Grace flinched. Her arms instinctively wrapped tighter around Lily, who lay asleep against her chest, cheeks pink from the cold. The little girl stirred, then whimpered. "I'm sorry," Grace whispered hoarsely, barely audible over the rumble of the city bus. "She's just sleeping, I'll..." But the man cut her off with a loud sigh, and then, as if on cue, Lily let out a piercing cry that seemed to rattle every grimy window on the bus. The driver snapped his rearview mirror upward. "Ma'am, can you get her quiet? People are trying to get home in peace." "I'm trying," Grace murmured, her voice cracking. She gently bounced Lily on her lap, rocking her with trembling arms. The child's cries grew louder, more frantic, like a storm building in a bottle. Eyes turned, one by one. Glances that sliced. Whispers started. A phone camera lifted. Someone muttered, "This is why babies don't belong on night buses." Grace's vision blurred. 10 hours on her feet. No dinner. Rent past due. The cold from the New York night still clung to her skin. She was unraveling, silently, invisibly, until a calm, warm voice rose from across the aisle. "Excuse me," he said. "May I try something?" She turned, startled. He was mid-30s, clean-shaven, wrapped in a navy wool coat. Leather gloves rested on his lap. His expression wasn't pity, it was understanding. "I've got nieces," he said with a soft smile. Sometimes a new pair of arms makes all the difference. Grace hesitated. Every cell in her body screamed to say no. Life had taught her to be careful, not to lean, not to ask. But the weight of the stairs was too heavy. She nodded. Slowly. He reached out carefully as if Lily were made of glass. And when he took the child in his arms, something miraculous happened. Her cries turned to hiccups, then to silence. She curled against his chest like it was home. Grace stared stunned. Her daughter had never calmed that fast, not even with her. "She likes you," she said, her voice a breath. "She's tired and warm, that's all," he answered gently. The tremble in Grace's limbs turned to stillness. She didn't even notice when her head dipped, heavy with exhaustion, until it rested against his shoulder. He didn't flinch, didn't shift. He simply adjusted his posture and, without saying a word, removed his coat and wrapped it around Lily's tiny frame. No one spoke. The rest of the bus had gone quiet, not out of kindness but out of discomfort. No one helped. No one apologized. They just watched. And in that strange hush, as the man rocked Lily with the practiced calm of someone who understood more than he let on, Grace closed her eyes, just for a moment. When she woke again hours later, she was wrapped in silence, warmth, and something she hadn't felt in years. Safety. She jolted up. "Oh my God. I'm so sorry, I didn't mean to." The man looked at her, his tone unshaken. "It's fine. You were exhausted. Anyone would be." Grace blinked, then blinked again. The bus slowed to a halt, her stop. "This is us," she whispered. He handed Lily back gently, carefully ensuring the coat stayed around her. Grace tried to meet his eyes. "I don't know what I would have done without you tonight." He only smiled. "You'd have figured it out. You're doing great." The doors slid open. Grace stepped off into the snowy dark. She turned for one last look. Through the dim window, his face was calm, already fading into the shadows of the city. And somewhere inside her something stirred. The apartment still smelled faintly of damp carpet and reheated soup. Grace pushed open the door with her shoulder, Lily cradled against her hip, and a plastic grocery bag swinging from her other hand. The door groaned shut behind her, echoing into the silence. She wrapped Lily in a threadbare blanket, kissed her forehead, and sat down alone at the small kitchen table. The fridge was nearly empty, canned beans, half a loaf of bread, and a sliver of apple juice. Her fingers brushed against a red-marked final notice stuck to the fridge door. She dropped her face into her hands. She'd applied to 3 more jobs that week. Nothing. Daycare had sent Lily home twice because of a cough, and her shifts at the diner had been cut again. The only thing that hadn't left her was exhaustion. Still her mind drifted. To the warmth of someone else's coat. To the sound of even breathing beside her on that night bus. To the way Lily had curled up in a stranger's arms like she belonged there. She didn't even know his name. But the memory of him was as steady as the rhythm of Lily's breath in sleep. 2 days passed. The rain came again. A cold Wednesday drizzle. The bell over the diner door jingled, pulling Grace from her half-thoughts. She looked up, mug in hand, then froze. He was there. Ethan. Shaking the rain from his coat. Looking around casually. Then his eyes found hers. "Hello," he said like it was the most natural thing in the world. "Didn't expect to see you again." Grace nearly dropped the coffee pot. She fumbled, set it down, wiped her hands on her apron. Her heart thudded loud enough to drown out the radio in the corner. I didn't either," she said, voice barely steady. "Small city, I guess." He smiled faintly. "Busy today?" "Depends on the hour." She motioned to the nearly empty diner. "Would you like a table?" "Just coffee. Black." She poured it with fingers that betrayed her, trembling slightly. She set it in front of him and he nodded in thanks. She turned to clean a tray, anything to escape the heat rising to her cheeks. But through the stainless reflection of the counter, she saw him watching. Not with scrutiny but presence. He didn't speak. Didn't ask questions. Just sat there sipping slowly, quietly. And in the stillness of the diner, with the hum of old ceiling fans and rain tapping against the windows, Grace felt something shift. Not fear. Not pressure. Just calm. That night, as she walked to work again beneath the gray sky, her steps slowed. Something hung on the diner door, a plain paper bag. She looked around. No one. The street was empty but for the occasional passing car. She lifted the bag gently. It was heavier than it looked. Inside, 2 canisters of infant formula, children's cough syrup, a pack of cartoon tissues, and a folded note. I think Lily might need these. Her hand trembled. Her breath caught. He hadn't asked. He hadn't judged. He had just noticed. And somewhere deep in her chest, gratitude warred with pride. That night, the bag sat behind the counter untouched. Grace served coffee, cleaned tables, forced her mind to focus. But it drifted back to that quiet man, the one who saw too much and said too little. And just before closing, the bell rang again. He stepped in, rain in his hair, calm in his eyes, like a page turning in a story she hadn't dared to finish. The bag was still behind the counter when Ethan walked in again. Right at 5:30, just as the rain turned from mist to downpour. Grace stood still, arms folded, spine straight as steel behind the counter. The fluorescent lights above flickered softly, but nothing about the air in the diner felt soft. He stepped inside, calm as ever, and immediately noticed the tension etched into her face. "Hi," he said gently. "We need to talk," Grace replied, her voice firmer than she meant it to be. He nodded. "All right. I found the bag. I hoped you would," he said simply. Her jaw clenched. "I didn't ask for help." "No," he agreed. "You didn't. Then why?" Her voice cracked slightly. The exhaustion and embarrassment tangled in her throat. "Why would you do that? You don't even know me." The diner had gone quiet. A lone man in the back booth paused his bite into a burger. A waitress stilled mid-step. Even the kitchen radio seemed to lower its volume. Ethan didn't flinch. "Because you're raising a daughter alone. Because I saw you hold it together when everything was falling apart. Because you smiled at strangers when you had every reason not to." "I'm not a charity case," Grace whispered, every word laced with something raw and aching. "I never said you were," Ethan said softly. "Then what am I to you?" He looked at her for a long moment, choosing his words with the precision of someone who'd never wanted to get it wrong. "You're strong," he said finally. "You're doing something most people would collapse under. I didn't leave that bag because I thought you were weak. I left it because I saw how hard you're fighting." Grace's shoulders sagged just a little. Her eyes stung. "I don't know how to accept things like that," she murmured. "I don't expect you to," he replied. It came without strings. No pity. Just respect. A few booths down, someone coughed awkwardly. The air inside the diner thickened like rising steam. No one moved. No one spoke. Grace looked at him, conflicted, but something in her was softening. "I don't know what this is," she said, her voice quieter now. Ethan nodded. "Neither do I. But I know what it's not." He reached into his coat pocket and placed something gently on the counter between them. It was Lily's stuffed bunny. The one she dropped the night before and Grace hadn't even noticed was missing. It was clean. Mended. One ear stitched back in place. Grace's eyes widened. Her throat tightened. "Where did you?" "You left it on the bus. I saw it under the seat. I didn't want her to lose it." Grace looked down at the soft little creature and then back at him. The man who noticed what no one else ever did. The man who returned not just toys but dignity. Behind them, the cook peeked from the kitchen wide-eyed. The waitress whispered to a customer. But no one interrupted. The air was still. Like the moment before thunder. And as Grace held the bunny to her chest, something in the way she stared at Ethan changed. She wasn't scared anymore. But in a booth 2 tables over, the man who'd once snapped at her on the bus, the same one now sitting with a cheap coffee and a mocking grin, shifted in his seat. He recognized the voice. The girl. The man. And for the first time his smirk cracked. Just slightly. The diner held its breath. Grace stood at the counter, the stuffed bunny still warm in her hands. Ethan didn't move. The man 2 booths over, now visibly squirming, tried to focus on his coffee. But something had shifted. "Is that him?" Ethan asked quietly without turning. Grace didn't answer with words. Her eyes did. Ethan nodded once. Then calmly reached into the inner pocket of his coat. He pulled out his phone, tapped the screen a few times and turned it around. The screen lit up with grainy footage, security camera footage from the bus. Grace recognized the scene immediately. Her holding Lily. The crying. The sighs. And then the man's face, clear as day, leaning forward and snarling at her. The volume was off, but his expression said enough. Gasps echoed across the diner. Someone at the far booth whispered, "Is that?" Ethan didn't raise his voice. He simply set the phone on the counter, screen still glowing, and turned toward the man in the booth. "You owe her an apology," he said quietly. The man scoffed, but it was forced. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, shifting in his seat. "I didn't do anything." "No." Grace's voice cut through like ice. She stepped forward, standing beside Ethan now, no longer behind the counter. "Because I remember the way you looked at me. I remember the way everyone stayed silent. Including you." The man stood abruptly, pushing his chair back with a screech. "I didn't mean anything by it." "But you did," Ethan said. "You made a woman feel smaller just because she was tired and doing her best." A young waitress, barely 20, stepped forward with shaking hands and refilled a glass. She didn't speak, but her eyes flicked to Grace and then down, ashamed. Another diner regular, a man in a flannel jacket, muttered, "We all saw it. We just didn't say anything." Grace looked around. The silence wasn't cruel anymore. It was regretful. That's when the bell over the door jingled again. A new presence entered. Not a cop, not a hero, just a woman in her 60s, in a Harbor House badge and a navy blazer. She walked straight toward the counter, gave Grace a small, respectful nod, and stood quietly beside her. "Is there a problem here?" she asked Ethan. He shook his head. "Not anymore." The man's shoulders sagged. He looked around and realized no one was on his side. Not the staff, not the customers, not even the silence. And so he did the only thing a man like that could do. He left. Quickly, quietly. As the door closed behind him, the weight in the room shifted. Grace didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply placed the stuffed bunny on the counter and exhaled. The woman in the Harbor House badge turned to her. "You handled that with more grace than most." Grace just nodded. Behind her, Ethan was watching, not with pride but with understanding. At the table near the door, the flannel jacket man stood, walked over, paused, then held out a hand. "I should have said something that night," he murmured. "I'm sorry." Grace looked at him, not with anger, but with something deeper, a quiet reckoning. She reached out and shook his hand. "I get it," she said. "Silence feels safe. Until it isn't." No applause followed. No dramatic exit. Just the image of a woman once invisible now standing. And the door that had slammed behind a coward now stayed closed. The diner didn't return to normal that evening. It changed. But not loudly, not with speeches or grand gestures. The change crept in slowly, like warmth crawling back into fingers after too long in the cold. Grace stood behind the counter again, wiping down the laminate surface out of habit more than need. Her hands moved on their own, but her mind was somewhere else, still echoing with the silence after that man walked out. Not victorious, not bitter, just still. The flannel jacket man returned to his booth. He didn't pick up his fork. He just sat there staring out the window, the reflection of his own shame caught in the glass. The young waitress approached Grace again. This time she didn't flinch or fidget. She reached into her apron and held out a clean hand towel, folded neatly. "For Lily, if she ever spills juice again," she said softly. Grace looked at the towel, then up at the girl. She was barely older than a teenager, and her eyes were glossy with something close to tears. Grace nodded. No smile. Just a quiet thank you. That was enough. Later, an older woman from a back booth, someone Grace had served coffee to for months, stood slowly, walked over, and placed a small wrapped cookie on the counter. "From home," she whispered. "It's got cinnamon. Maybe Lily'll like it." Again Grace only nodded. It wasn't just the gifts. It was the way the air shifted. The way no one stared anymore. The way their eyes lowered. Not in dismissal but in recognition. They weren't watching her like a burden. They were remembering she was one of them. That she'd always been there. And Grace, she didn't lecture. Didn't scold. She didn't mention the man who left, or the silence that had hung like fog. She only worked. Refilled cups. Wiped down booths. Smoothed her apron. And when someone looked her way longer than usual, she met their eyes. Not with defiance but with grace. Ethan stayed, of course. He never spoke unless spoken to. But his presence was a signal now. Not of protection but of witness. At one point a regular customer, an elderly man with thick glasses and trembling hands, stood at the door before leaving. He turned back, cleared his throat and said, "Place feels better tonight." Grace didn't reply, but she heard it. Later that week, a chalkboard appeared near the register. It had always been there but no one really used it. That morning someone, no one admitted who, had written in white chalk, "Be kind. Everyone's carrying something you can't see." The handwriting was clumsy, but the message was clear. Grace stared at it for a long moment, then picked up a rag and gently cleaned around the board, careful not to smudge the words. She didn't speak of the man who had left, or the ones who had watched in silence. She didn't need to. Sometimes forgiveness isn't about forgetting. It's about holding the door open anyway. That night when she closed up, she turned off the lights, looked once more at the board, then whispered to herself, "Maybe this place can feel like home again." Weeks passed. Spring arrived in quiet stages, cracks in the pavement blooming with weeds, birds returning to the city skyline, soft golden light filtering through the diner's dusty windows. But the biggest change wasn't in the air. It was in the room. The diner looked the same at first glance. The same cracked tiles, the same sticky menus, the same hum of the fridge that always ran too loud. But something had shifted. A small photo frame appeared near the register. Inside was a snapshot. Grace holding Lily, both bundled in coats, the toddler asleep in her arms, a blurry bus window behind them. Someone had printed the photo off security footage. Someone who must have found the moment worth preserving. Beneath it, in small block letters, "Keep going. Someone sees you." No one claimed credit, but no one questioned its presence either. Next to the frame, a small donation jar had appeared. Taped to it was a hand-drawn sign in messy blue marker. "For single moms in our city." There were crumpled bills inside by noon. Grace didn't ask for it, didn't announce it. She simply glanced at it the first morning, touched the photo gently, then went back to pouring coffee. The community didn't need permission. They had already begun to change. A group of high school students, teenagers who'd once loitered on the curb outside, now came in twice a week. They cleared dishes, wiped down tables and listened to Grace. Not because it was extra credit, because she had become a living lesson in resilience. One of them, Maya, barely 16, stayed late one night to ask, "Do you think someone like me could lead something someday?" Grace didn't hesitate. "You already are." Word spread. Quietly, like stories passed from porch to porch. The woman who stood her ground. The mother who didn't yell, didn't fold. The man who watched. The bunny that returned. The silence that changed. Local newspapers printed a small piece about Harbor House's new initiative. They mentioned a woman who'd once worked triple shifts and now trained other mothers to navigate housing applications and job interviews. They didn't name Grace, but they didn't need to. Her work spoke louder. At Harbor House, Grace kept her name off the plaques. She ran workshops, comforted new moms, coordinated daycare rotations. And she listened. That was her true power. She let others tell their story, so they wouldn't have to carry it alone. Lily would sometimes sit in the corner drawing. She'd hand her mother crayon sketches of our house, always with 3 stick figures and a little heart floating above. One day, while helping paint a mural on the Harbor House lobby wall, a volunteer added a quiet detail in the background, barely visible. A woman on a bus seat, a child sleeping, a coat wrapped around them. It wasn't signed. Didn't need to be. And when Grace walked past it days later, arms full of clipboards and schedules, she paused. Only for a second. But in that second, everything stopped. Her eyes softened. Her shoulders relaxed. She didn't say a word. She didn't have to. Because in that mural, in that diner, in the stories passed quietly from one woman to the next, her dignity had become more than survival. It had become a symbol. It was late Sunday afternoon. The diner had closed early for once, something Ethan had quietly arranged, citing staff appreciation, though everyone knew the real reason. The booths were empty, the lights dimmed, the radio silent for the first time in days. Grace stood behind the counter, wiping her hands on a dish towel, while Ethan pulled 2 mugs from the shelf, faded ceramic ones with tiny chips along the rim. "Hot chocolate okay?" he asked, already pouring the powdered mix into each cup. She nodded, her smile small but honest. It's been a while since I've had any without splitting it with Lily. He handed her a mug, then walked to the booth by the window, the one they always gravitated toward when things felt too loud outside. She followed without speaking. Outside, the street was quiet. A few leaves drifted in the breeze, catching in the corners of the sidewalk. The golden hour was slipping gently into dusk. They sat across from each other, the table between them worn smooth by years of elbows and stories. But in this moment it held only stillness. Ethan stirred his drink slowly. Then, "You okay, Grace?" She looked up at him. The question was simple, but it held more weight than most confessions. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I think I'm learning to be." He nodded, no need to reply. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and placed something on the table. An envelope, creased and slightly smudged. "What's that?" she asked, her voice soft. He slid it toward her. "Just something I started writing the night you called me about Lily. I never finished it. Didn't know if I'd give it to you." She picked it up, turned it over in her hands but didn't open it. "Not yet." They sipped quietly for a few minutes. The hum of the overhead lights. The distant echo of traffic. A safe silence. Then Ethan leaned forward slightly. "Do you remember what Lily said that night on the bus?" Grace smiled. "If you were a pillow, I'd never want to let go." He chuckled, eyes crinkling at the corners. "Yeah, that one stuck." She placed her mug down, then without thinking, reached across the table and laid her hand gently on top of his. Just skin on skin. No rush. No question. Just the quiet of two people who had been alone for far too long. Finally not alone anymore. Outside, a child's laugh echoed faintly, then faded. Inside, the two sat in stillness. Eventually, Grace broke it. "I'm still scared," she whispered. "I know," he said. "But you don't have to be alone in it." She nodded slowly. On the table beside the untouched envelope, Ethan placed a small silver key. It wasn't shiny. It wasn't new. But Grace understood its meaning immediately. "Only if you're ready," he said. She didn't pick it up. But she didn't push it away either. They sat like that for a long time, the last rays of light catching in her hair. His thumb brushing lightly over her knuckles. When they finally stood to leave, neither said goodbye. They didn't need to. At the door, Ethan paused, then took off his coat and draped it over Grace's shoulders, not because she looked cold, but because he remembered the weight she carried the night they met. She looked at him. "Thank you for staying." He didn't answer. He simply reached out, gently fixed the collar of her coat, and nodded. Outside, the wind picked up. A paper cup rolled down the sidewalk. And through the diner's glass door, two silhouettes lingered, framed not by neon signs or drama, but by a quiet, unmistakable thing called trust. Grace's story didn't stay in the diner. It slipped quietly into other corners of the city, into Sunday morning sermons where pastors spoke of quiet strength, into classrooms where teachers reminded students that bravery isn't always loud. At the local barber shop, a framed clipping appeared one morning. A grainy photo of Grace standing in front of Harbor House, Lily in her arms, both smiling. The headline: "From Survivor to Builder." She never gave interviews, never stepped behind a podium, but others did it for her. Clients at Harbor House whispered her name in waiting rooms. A local podcaster retold the night on the bus, someone who'd been there, too ashamed to admit he hadn't spoken up. The story gained no fame, no viral glory, but it grew in a slower, deeper way. The kind of growth that roots itself in the hearts of ordinary people. At Roosevelt High, a student named Jonah, once known for skipping class, started a volunteer club. Their first project: raising funds for Harbor House. Their motto: "We speak when it matters." At the city library, a wall near the children's section displayed sketches by kids who lived at Harbor House. One drawing showed a woman with curly hair holding a baby beside a tall building labeled, "Our Safe Place." No one labeled it Grace, but everyone knew. And at Harbor House itself, change deepened. Mothers who once stared at the floor during intake meetings now sat straighter, asked more questions, took notes. Grace trained them not by lecturing but by listening. Her presence didn't demand attention. It earned it. She would enter a room and voices would lower, not out of fear but respect. Lily, now 3, toddled confidently through the halls. She'd wave to volunteers, hand out her crayon drawings and proudly say, "My mommy helps the mommies." One afternoon, a woman named Celia, new to the shelter, confessed that she'd almost left the first night. "I thought no one here would get it," she whispered. "Then I saw you. You didn't even say anything. But I could see it. You've walked through it too." Grace simply held her hand and said, "You're not alone now." From across the street, a mural took shape on a brick wall facing Harbor House. Local artists, volunteers, and even a few residents contributed. The centerpiece was a silhouette, woman and child, side by side, surrounded by gentle waves of color. It wasn't labeled. Again, it didn't need to be. In the nearby playground, a small girl ran up to pick a flower that had pushed through a crack in the sidewalk. Her father called her back gently. She turned, clutching the daisy like a trophy. That same girl would grow up hearing the story of Grace Parker, not from textbooks, but from the way her community remembered. From the way Harbor House stood tall, even during storms. From the way volunteers showed up with casseroles and crayons. From the way people finally understood that strength doesn't need applause, just room to grow. And late one evening, as the wind rustled the flags above the center, a teenage boy, one who once mocked a tired mother on a bus, stood quietly by the fence, reading the plaque by the gate. He didn't say anything. But the next day, he brought 6 bags of groceries and asked where to unload them. The sun dipped low behind the trees of the same park where it all began. Where a coat became a shelter. Where a bunny came back home. Where hope first cracked open inside a tired mother's chest. White chairs lined the grass. Lily scattered petals with both hands, wearing a white dress and a grin that couldn't be contained. Grace walked slowly, a simple lace gown brushing her ankles, her eyes never leaving Ethan, who waited beneath the old oak. They whispered their vows, words barely audible but loud in meaning. And when the ceremony ended, the 3 of them wandered beyond the crowd, just a blanket, a breeze, and the sky. Lily lay between them, her head on Grace's lap. "Do sunsets ever get tired?" she asked sleepily. Grace smiled softly. "No, baby. They're just taking turns with the moon." And as the first fireflies danced in the dusk, the 3 of them sat still, shoulder to shoulder, heart to heart, quiet, whole, and home. If you felt something in that silence, don't scroll away. Comment one word, belonging. And if you believe love like this still exists, this place, this story, this channel is where it lives.